Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this series by CAT by LPT. And the series that we are running is top 200 most challenging questions for CAT. And especially we are dealing with a VARC section today. You have already had one session, I guess, with Ajay sir. Today you have the second one. And what we are going to do is we are going to solve some really good questions that will help you to understand how do you solve VARC section when it comes down to reading comprehension, and then it also comes down to VA questions. So I'm sure guys, for those of you who are watching me and those of you who are familiar with the CAT pattern, we have the VARC section which is again divided into two major parts. So you have some questions of RC and you have some questions of VA. Okay. If you go by the last year's paper pattern, you had 16 questions of RC and you had 8 questions of VA. So what we are going to do is we are going to solve some good quality questions of CAT, and we will look into how to deal with the questions, and most importantly I will be focusing on what is the approach towards solving those questions. Okay, so whether it is RC, whether it is VA, so when you see RC, you already understand that you can have an RC from any topic, from any resource. Okay, so CAT is very broad in that sense. Now when it comes down to VA questions again divided into 3 parts, which was on the basis of the last year's pattern. So there was no para jumble question last year, so that was a surprise element. But then the point was when you talk about the questions that come in VA part, so you have odd one out, that is one variety that you encounter. You have para summary questions, and of course you have sentence placement questions. So these are the 3 variety that we will be dealing with. So without wasting any more time, let us get started, and I would be focusing on the point that we will be solving these questions together, and we will try to understand how to solve a summary question, how to solve an odd one out question, or any other question for that matter. Remember one thing guys, because you are talking about CAT VARC, the VARC section tests your comprehension skills. So if you are somebody who is good with comprehension, vocabulary will not be a obstacle, right? If you are somebody who reads a lot, you will be comfortable. If you are somebody who is consistent with practice, you would be comfortable. So when you practice these questions, I'm sure your preparation would be going in full swing at this point of time, and you would be doing many questions. Particularly you would have done RCs, and so let's get started with some VA questions first, and then we will go to the RC somewhere in the middle, and then we will quickly go back to the VA questions. So let's get started. So let me just go back to the question here and see to this. Right, let's start with this question first. Right, so what you have now is a para summary question. All right, and I'm sure you know what para summary questions are. So when you talk about a para summary question, you are looking at the main details of that passage, and when you have these 4 options, we are trying to figure out what is the flaw in other options before we start marking a right answer. So just have a quick look at the 24th question and try to solve it. I hope guys you are in the process of reading this and trying to solve this question. 2 minutes before we start discussing. Okay guys, so I believe you have already solved this question and you have some answer. Now see, the trick behind solving a paragraph summary question is something that is again on the basics of your skills. So I tell students that when you're solving a para summary question, the most important detailing is how well you understand the passage here. So let us try to solve this question together and try to understand what should have been the approach and how you should have actually solved this question here. So let's read out this one. So it says, uh, the passage given below is followed by 4 alternative summaries. Choose the option that best captures the essence of the passage. So because we want to understand the essence of the passage here, the important point is that you have to understand the main details of the passage. So let's quickly read it through. So it says, colonialism is not a modern phenomena. World history is full of examples of one society gradually expanding by incorporating adjacent territory and settling its people on newly conquered territory. So what it says is that colonialism is an age-old phenomena. Fine. So modern is not a modern phenomena, it's an age-old phenomena. World history is full of examples of one society gradually expanding by incorporating adjacent territory and settling the people on newly acquired territory. So yes, colonialism is that defined that ways. In the 16th century, colonialism changed decisively. So there was a change in the 16th century. So what was the change here? It says decisively because of technological developments. Okay, so we are talking about colonialism getting changed or getting diverted in some sort decisively because of technological developments in navigation that began to connect more remote parts of the world. So yes, colonialism was then influenced by these technological developments in navigation. Okay, the modern European colonial project. So we are talking about modern European colonial project emerged when it became possible to move large number of people across the ocean and to maintain political control in spite of geographical dispersion. So we are talking about moving people from one place to another, okay, and move large number of people across the ocean and maintain political control in spite of geographical dispersion. The term colonialism is used to describe the process of European settlement. So we are precisely talking about European settlement here. Violent dispossession, so violent dispossession, that is moving people from one area to another area, and political domination over the rest of the world, including the Americas, Australia and parts of Africa and Asia. So this is basically understanding what are the details important here. So we started with the first half, we ended towards the second half, and we imagine certain things here, that there are certain details which is important. The one that I have highlighted here are the main points that we are discussing here. Let's look at how to go about the answers. Now students, understand something very important, that when you are solving a para summary question, the most important detailing is about the fact that you have to eliminate your choices. Okay, so you have to eliminate your choices, and when you eliminate your choices, you have to figure out where does the flaw lies. So if your elimination game is stronger, let's look at how do we put elimination here. The first option says colonialism surged in the 16th century due to advancements in navigation, enabling British settlements abroad and global dominance. So we have some point here. Let's discuss what this says. So it says colonialism surge. So this is fine. Now it does not mention, however, that colonialism is a modern phenomena. Okay, so that point is missing there. Anyway, so colonialism surged in the 16th century due to advancements in navigation. This has been given here, and of course it's important. Enabling British settlements abroad and global dominance. So we did not talk about global dominance per se, but yes, when you talk about British settlements, we were precisely talking about European colonial projects. Okay, so this is what we were referring to. And then if you look at this example here, it says British settlement, so the fact is again twisted. Now when you look at this option, understand two things are missing. So one was of course that it is not a modern phenomena, something that is related to it, and then you talked about the technological developments which was important to be incorporated into our summary, right? And then it mentions British settlements, whereas we are talking about European settlements here. So on the basis of this information, I believe that this can be easily eliminated. This is not the right choice. Okay, let's have a look at the second one now. It says as a result of development in navigation technology, so European colonialism led to the displacement of indigenous populations. Okay, we have not talked about indigenous populations as such, and global political changes in the 16th century. So here you have a cause-effect relationship. So they have said as a result of developments is navigation. So we will have to verify whether you do have a cause like that. C says colonialism conceptualized in the 16th century allowed colonizers to expand their territories, which is okay, establish settlements and exercise political power. However, the problem with this option is it does not mention technological advancement. So yes, technological development was a short point that has to be incorporated in our summary because it was important. So if you look at C option, this would again be eliminated. That leaves us with the D option by saying technological advancement. So you have the mentionment here. In navigation in the 16th century transformed colonialism. So we were talking about colonialism per se, alright, enabling Europeans to establish settlements and exert political dominance over distant regions. So when you're solving a para summary question, guys, just remember one thing, that once you understand the gist of the passage, look for that gist in your option. And when you are looking at these options, the main important point is you have to figure out what is the flaw. Okay, so what is the flow with the option here that will enable you to due to mark an answer here. So you have this point here. So it is British settlement, which was wrong. There is a wrong cause and effects, effect mentioned in the B option, and C misses out on the point of technological advancement. So of course that leaves us with option 4, which is the correct answer choice. It has incorporated almost all the criteria that was discussed in the passage, which also includes dispossession, then political domination and European settlement. So if you understand the most important aspects here, most of these aspects is taken care. So that would be the answer choice. Just let me know if you have any questions regarding any option that is still confusing you, and we can deal with that. Okay. So we are done with the question here. Let's go to some other question now. Let's practice. Okay, let us practice one more para summary question. Just have a look at this and try to figure out the answer. So you have this passage here. Read the passage, try to understand the details, find out the major points here. Then when you are solving in terms of the options that is given to you, try to figure out what is the flaw in the options and then choose an appropriate summary. So here is the question, guys. Just let me know if you have any answers. So just solve a question. Okay guys, I think you would have solved this question by now. Let's quickly look at how do we solve this question. So yes, let's figure out what are the important points here and which are the points that you need to keep in mind when you're looking for an ideal summary. So it says manipulating information was a feature of history long before modern journalism established rules of integrity. So you are talking about manipulating information here, all right, was a feature of history long before. So you have, 1 second. Okay, so it says, okay, long before modern journalism established rules of integrity. A record dates back to ancient Rome when Antony met Cleopatra. So you have a historical reference here, and his political enemy Octavian launched a smear campaign against him with short, sharp slogans written upon coins. So you have an example that is being given to you in terms of manipulating information. So it says the perpetrator became the first Roman emperor and fake news had allowed Octavian to hack the Republican system once and for all. So this is all about manipulating information, and this is what has been talked about. Let's read further and see to it. It says, but in the 21st century has seen the weaponization of information. Now this is important. So talking about weaponization of information on an unprecedented scale. So this is unparalleled, or this is unprecedented, something that has not happened before. Powerful new technology makes the fabrication of, so you have a clear-cut mention here, powerful new technology makes the fabrication of content simple, and social networks amplify falsehoods peddled by states, populist politicians and dishonest corporate entities. So we are talking about who is gaining in terms of manipulating this information. The platforms have become fertile ground for computational propaganda. So we talk about propaganda, trolling and troll armies. So this is what we are talking about, and the point is the things that you have mentioned in the passage should find some relevance in terms of the options also. Let's evaluate our options. Let's see to it why other options are wrong and which option makes the closest ideal summary to this particular question. So it says disinformation. Okay, so it says disinformation. Of course, we are talking about manipulating information, and this says disinformation, which is mediated by. Now this says mediated, here it says we have used the term here in terms of technology, which is weaponization of information, which is powerful new technology. Just mediated by technology today is not new. So okay, it does mention the fact is not new and has existed since ancient times. So this is like slightly on a lower side in terms of how accurate it is presenting the facts here. So let us keep it aside here. Second one says people need to become critical of what they read. So this is not what the passage wants to say. Okay, need to be critical of what they read, since historically weaponization of information has led to corruption. We did not talk about corruption in the passage, so that does not really make sense. Okay, so this is slightly on a divergent side here. So this can be clearly cancelled out, and this also mentions disinformation as opposed to manipulating information here. Alright, so we are talking about this information which is being manipulated. Let's look at the C option. It says use of misinformation or manipulating information for attaining power. A practice that is as old as the Octavian era is currently fueled by technology, right? So you have a clear mention of technology here, and this is what we were looking for, because when we were discussing here, we said here that it was weaponization of information on an unprecedented scale, and it was fueled by powerful new technology. So this finds a mention in this option. So seems okay. Let's also evaluate the D option and see to it. It says Octavian used fake news to, fake news is too much of an understatement here, to manipulate people. We did not talk about manipulate people, but we just give an example here, and it says and attain power and influence just as people do today. So we have not talked about the people doing it today, and this is very flimsical on the grounds that it does not essentially capture the main point, which is technology. So technology is outrightly missing from this question, so this is cancelled out. If you look at these options, then the C1 comes closest to the ideal summary, because it not only talks about misinformation of attaining power, it also talks about the Octavian era, which is an example that is given in the passage, and it also mentions technology. So that forms the correct answer to this question. Summary questions are all about how good and bad you are at eliminating options once you understand the differences, because see, you have a paragraph and you have common options here, so you need to identify the differences and see to it which one matches with the previous one. So this is the clear-cut question here. I hope this is clear. If you have any more doubts, just let me know. I'll just quickly answer. Meanwhile, we can move to the next question. And yes, so let's move to the next question. Right, so you have a para-jumble question here. I'm sure you would have figured it out by now that when you talk about para-jumble question, It's about identifying the sequence of a question. So practice this question and then we can try to answer this one. You have a parajumble question, guys. So with 4 sentences, try to solve it, and after 2 minutes we will try to look at the approach to answer this question. Last 1 minute before we start discussing this question. Alright guys, so I believe you would have a sequence in your mind in terms of solving this question. Now remember, when you are solving a parajumble question, it's all about remembering the basics of how to solve a parajumble. It's also about your reading and comprehension skills, and it is also about your ability to identify the mandatory pairs. So let's quickly start with solving a parajumble question here. So let's read out the sentences and try to make sense which word would come first, which would come later. So this says, what precisely are the unusual elements that make a particular case so attractive to a certain kind of audience? So we are talking about what are the unusual elements of a particular case. So we are discussing a case here, and it says why it is that so attractive to a certain kind of audience. So we are raising a question here. So you have a question mark. That's okay. Let's read the second sentence. It says, it might be a particularly savage or unfathomable level of depravity. Very often it has something to do with the precise amount of mystery involved. So when you read this sentence, I'm sure you would have figured it out that this cannot be the opening, because it is somewhere in the middle of the sequence, right? So I can keep it aside. Let's read out the third sentence. It says, unsolved and perhaps unsolvable cases offer something that ordinary murder does not. Okay, that is again fine. Then it says, why are some crimes destined for perpetual re-examination and others locked into permanent obscurity? So if you would have noticed by now, there are 2 sentences with this which is starting with a question. And if you remember your parajumble basics, I told you that when you are making a mandatory pair, you remember something, that if your question has a question and an answer to it. So if you look at this one, the sentence 2 provides you an insight into the mystery. Okay, so it says what? It might be a particularly savage or unfathomable level of depravity. Very often it has something. So this is answering the questions to the question that is being raised in 1 and 4. So then the opening point has to be somewhere from 1 and 4. So if you read out this first one, it says unusual elements of a particular case. Okay, that is very specific. And this talks about why are some crimes destined for perpetual re-examination and others locked into permanent obscurity. So if you look at a broader concept, because I'm sure that you would have learned in your parajumble classes that we move from a broad concept to a specific concept. So you will start with 4 here. So 4 starts. You will start with a question. You have another question that is a specific question here. So it ends with 1. Okay, so 4, 1 is a sequence. This is general, this is specific. So you move from general to specific. Now you have the second one, which is giving you a kind of, yes. So you look at the next one, which is giving you an answer to these 2 questions. It says it might be particularly savage or unfathomable level of depravity. Very often it has something to do. This is answering your questions. So 4, 1, 2 forms a pair, and of course third one says unsolved and perhaps unsolvable cases offer something that ordinary murder does not. So you have 4, 1, 2, 3. So this was a simple question of a parajumble question solved on the basis of your basics of parajumbles and just understanding what the sentences are saying and how do you arrange them. So here is the answer, guys, which is 4, 1, 2, 3. So you start with the question, you answer that question and you conclude that paragraph. I hope this is clear. So we can move on to the next question now. So this is 4, 1, 2, 3, which is the ideal sequence for this question. Yes, you have one more question of parajumble. Start solving this, guys. You have one more minute. Try solving it and then we will decide what should have been the approach here. Okay, let's try and figure out how to solve this question by using the fundamentals of parajumbles and understanding what are the process to arrive at a coherent sequence here. So let's read out the sentences first. Let's try to identify the opening statement while we are reading these sentences and try to identify the mandatory pairs. So it says algorithms hosted on the internet are accessed by many, so biases in AI models have resulted in much larger impact. So it talks about the biases in AI models and their impact. So you have larger impact adversely affecting far larger groups of people here. So of course the idea is clear, we can keep it aside. Then you have the second sentence here. It says though algorithmic bias. So we did talk about bias here. So it continues further. It says algorithmic bias is the popular term. The foundation of such bias is not in algorithms but in the data. So what it is saying is that the bias is not in the algorithm but it is in the data. Algorithms are not biased, data is. So it is not the algorithm that is biased, it is the data which is biased. as algorithms merely reflect persistent patterns that are present in the training data. So of course we are discussing the algorithmic bias here, and we have also talked about that it is not the algorithm which is biased, but it is more in terms of the data that is biased. Okay. Third says, despite their widespread impact, it is relatively easier to fix. So we talked about biases here, and we are talking about fixing the bias. So I understand that this sentence has to come before the next sentence. So of course this is talking about fixing the biases. Then human generated biases, as it is simpler to identify the former than to try to make people unlearn behaviors learned over generations. So if you closely examine this question, there is a problem that is being raised here. Okay, so let's look at the last sentence. It says the impact of biased decisions made by humans is localized and geographically confined, but with the advent of AI, the impact of such decisions is spread over a much wider sense. Now this cannot start, if you look at first and the fourth sentence, I believe that fourth does make sense, so it gives you an idea to start with. So it says what? The impact of biased decisions made by humans. So this is a more general point, this is a broader perspective. So it talks about impact of a biased decision made by humans, and then you talk about the advent of AI and the impact of such decision is spread over a much wider scale. So out of these sentences, 4-1 is the ideal starting. Now if you look at this one, because this one talks about the solution to a problem, so you have a problem being discussed here. Then you mention algorithms here, so it says algorithm hosted on the internet are assessed by many, so biases in AI models have resulted in much larger impact. So you talked about the biases first, then you're talking about the impact of such biases. So you have one coming in the picture here, and when you look at second one, it gives you a solution to that. It mentions that algorithms are not biased, it is the data which is biased. So 1 and 2 forms a pair. So 4 is the ideal opening, 1 and 2 forms a pair. Let's look at third. What does it say? It says fix the AI biases. So this is most likely to be the last statement here. So you have third coming up. The ideal sequence would be 4, 1, 2, 3. So you have a problem being introduced. You talk more about the impact of that problem. Then you talk about what it is actually, and then you conclude by saying what is the way to fix it. So you have arrived at a proper coherent sentence here. Alright guys, we can move on to the next question now. Right, so you have a paragraph completion question. Just have a look at this question and try to figure out the answer. one more minute before we start discussing the approach towards solving this question. Alright guys, so I believe you would have solved this question and you would have some idea in terms of which one do you think is the right answer. Let's approach this question and see to it how do we solve this question. Now when you're solving a sentence placement question, so what is the pattern of this question? That you will be given a sentence, okay, and you will be given a paragraph with blanks. What you're supposed to do is you have to choose an option where the sentence fits in. So out of this passage that is given to you with blanks, you have to decide an option that tells you in which of the blank will that particular sentence fit in. Okay. So let's quickly look at this question. Let's first read the sentence and then read the passage. It says, the discovery helps. So it talks about a certain discovery, helps to explain archaeological similarities. Okay. So you talked about similarities, archaeological similarities between the Paleolithic peoples of China, Japan and the Americas. So we are talking about a certain discovery here, and it says what? Helps to explain. What is that discovery trying to explain? So it tends to explain archaeological similarities between the Paleolithic peoples of China, Japan and the Americas. So we have understood the sentence that we are talking about a certain discovery, and this discovery tells us or explains us the archaeological similarity between the Paleolithic peoples of China, Japan and the Americas. Let's read the paragraph and try to make sense in which blank it would fit in. Okay, so it says the researchers also uncovered an unexpected genetic link between the Native Americans and the Japanese people. Okay. If you try to put it over here, so if I say the discovery, well, this just mentions the researcher, it does not mention discovery. So probably one cannot be the answer there. Let's just read further. It says, during the deglaciation period, another group branched out from northern coastal China and traveled to Japan. So we were talking about discovery in terms of the archaeological similarities. We find no reference here as such. So it says from northern coastal China and traveled to Japan. Okay, so that is fine. Let's keep this also aside. Now that says we were surprised to find that this ancestral source, okay, also contributed to the Japanese gene pool, especially the indigenous anus cells. And you have a third blank. They shared similarities. Okay, so you have a very important here. It says what? They shared similarities. So, right, we talked about that discovery helps to explain archaeological similarities, and we found that it talks about the peoples of China, Japan and the Americas. Here there is a sentence which says they shared similarities in how they crafted stemmed projectile portals to arrowheads and spears. Then you have the fourth blank here, and that says this suggests that the Pleistocene connection among the Americas, China and Japan was not confined to culture but also to genetics, says senior author Ping Pan, and you go on further. So if you look at the idea that is being talked about, we are talking about a certain research, and that research telling us about the archaeological similarities. If you go to the passage here, you have a line here which says they shared similarities. Here they refers to the people of China, Japan and America, and because we have mentioned similarities, so you have similarities, so the answer would be D, which is option 3. It is most likely to go into the third blank, which is option D here. I hope the approach is now clear to you. So read out the sentence precisely, look at the previous sentence, look at the following sentence and try to figure out the keywords that help you to identify where that sentence will fit in. Let's try and understand one more question. Yeah, so you have the 17th question. Again, a paragraph or a sentence placement question. Try doing this. Last 1 minute before we start discussing this question. Alright guys, so let's try and understand how to solve this question. Now since it is a sentence placement question, as I told you before, the idea is about understanding that statement which is not fixed in a particular blank here, and you are trying to figure out the previous sentence and the following sentence to look for keywords. So let's have a look at the sentence and try to understand, and then you read the passage here. So it says this philosophical cut. Okay, this is important. So we are talking about a philosophical cut in the previous sentence. So the sentence that comes before it would talk about some philosophical cut here. It says what? This philosophical cut at one's core beliefs, values and way of life is difficult enough. So it talks about the fact that the philosophical cut we are talking about, especially at one core's beliefs, values and the way of life, is difficult enough. It's a difficult phase. Okay, let's read the paragraph. It says, the experience of reading philosophy is often disquieting. So it is something that puzzles you, it is something that makes you uncomfortable. When reading philosophy, the values around which one has heretofore organized one's life may come to look provincial, flatly wrong, or even evil. So we are talking about experience of reading philosophy here, which is disquieting, it is puzzling, it is something that makes you uncomfortable. When reading philosophy, the values around which one has heretofore organized one's beliefs and lives may come to look provincial, flatly wrong, or even evil here. So let's just see, because this does not mention the philosophical cut as such. So first is not, of course, going to be the blank where we put that statement, because we have not talked about the kind of cut that we were referring to. Now, when beliefs previously held as truth are rendered implausible, implausible is something that is not reasonable. Okay, implausible, new beliefs, values and ways of living may be required. Now if you observe this sentence, this tells you about a kind of shift. Okay, then you have a blank over here. What's worse, philosophers admonish each other to remain unsuited until such time as a defensible new answer. So if you go further in the paragraph here, the problem is that it goes further and we are left with this philosophical cut. Let's look at this idea here which says what's worse. So it is giving you an even difficult phase here. So if you look at this sentence and you look at this particular blank, it says this philosophical cut. And what is the philosophical cut here? It says when beliefs previously held as truth are rendered implausible, new belief, values and ways of living may be required. So this is the philosophical cut that we are referring to, and the next sentence talks about what's worse. So it is the second option where it will fit in. So if you find the immediate reference and you find out the next line as well, you can quickly narrow down your options and you can solve that question, right? Let us also imagine, examine the rest of the issue. So here the entire discussion changes. So it is third here, and it says the reader of philosophy must be prepared for the possibility of this experience. So that does not mention the philosophical cut that we were referring to. So 3 is cancelled out and 4th is also cancelled out. So you have an answer here. Guys, if you have got any doubt with any of the options, just let me know. It is just that when you are solving a sentence placement question, you have to read the previous line and the following line to figure out where the keyword lies, and then you can probably fix in your sentence in that particular passage here. Now, we have done quite a questions of VA now. Let us move on to one RC and let us see how do you deal with it. So, let's look at the RC question. Right, so you have an RC passage here. Read the passage, guys, and then try to answer the questions. This is the first slide. माइक ऑन कर दिया. Good evening, Anirban. So we are solving an RC passage here. Try to read this passage and then we will go to the questions. This is the first slide. Just read this and then we will go to the next slide. Here is the next slide. Let me know once you are done reading the second slide. We can move on to the next one and we can go to the questions. Okay guys, so here is the first question. The first question on your screen. Any answers, guys? So any answers for the 13th question? So it says the inhabitants of Lozère have to grapple with all of the following problems except. Any answers for this? Okay, guys. So let us understand and go back to the passage and see where the answer lies. So let's quickly again read the question. It says the inhabitants of Lozère have to grapple with all of the following problems except. What this means that we are talking about three problems that this place grapples with. One would be the odd one out. That odd one out is our answer. So let's go back to the passage here. Okay. So if you look at, it says, as early as the 9th century, the royal office of the Lupari wolf catchers was created in France to tackle the predators. So we are talking about wolf here and we are talking about the predators. Those official hunters and others completed their job in the 1930s when the last wolf disappeared from the mainland. So this talks about that the last wolf disappeared from the mainland. Active hunting, so you have active hunting and improved technology. So you are talking about two factors here. One is active hunting and improved technology such as rifles in the 19th century, plus the use of poison such as strychnine later on caused the population collapse. But in the early 1990s, the animals reappeared. One second, guys. I think I'm missing a line here. Okay, we missed out on an important paragraph here. So here is the paragraph. So this is where it starts from. Residents of Lozère, a hilly department in southern France, recite complaints familiar. So you have complaints here familiar to many rural corners of Europe. So we are talking about this place here and we are saying that they recite complaints familiar to many rural corners of Europe in remote hamlets and villages with names such as La Bacon and La Bacon Bois. Mayors grumble about the lack of local schools. So you have lack of local schools, then you have jobs and you have phone and internet connections. So this particular passage mentions you three things. It talks about lack of local schools, it talks about jobs, it talks about phone and internet connections and so on. Let's go back to the question here and see to it. Right. So it says poor rural communication infrastructure, that can be inferred from the passage. So this cannot be the answer. Then it talks about lack of educational facilities. We mentioned school as well there. So this is not the answer. Then it says decline in the number of hunting licenses and livestock losses. So this has been mentioned, this has been mentioned, this cannot be the answer. The answer would be C option. So when you read through the passage here in terms of what it is talking about, you will quickly have an answer here. Any doubt with any option, just let me know and I'll get back to the passage here where you can find that information. Correct. That is C option. Yes, Anirban, correct answer. Good. Shall we move on to the next question now? That was 13th question for you. Let's go to the 14th question now. Yeah. Any answers, guys? So this question is, which one of the following has not contributed to the growing wolf population in Lozère? Last 30 seconds before we discuss the answers to this question. Okay, so let us examine the choices here. We have already read the passage and the details that has been mentioned here. Let's look at the options and try to figure out. So it says, which one of the following has not contributed to the growing wolf population in Lozère? Let's look at the option. First one says, the granting of protected status to wolves in Europe. Now, this has been mentioned in the passage here. If you have read the passage here, you would have understood that this particular thing has been mentioned here. So this cannot be the answer choice. Okay, let's read out the second option. It says the shutting down of the royal office of the Lupari. We will just imagine this one. Okay, it says an increase in woodlands and forest covers. Of course, it has led to the growing population of wolf in the city. So this is again mentioned. This cannot be the answer. It says a decline in the rural population of Lozère. Again, this has been mentioned in the passage. This cannot be the answer. The answer would be B, the shutting down of the royal office of the Lupari. Good, Anirban. That's the correct answer. I hope it is clear to everybody. If you have read the passage clearly, you will find this information. So A, C and D has been mentioned in the passage. It is B which does not have any impact on the growing wolf population in Lozère. Let's go to the next question now. Question number 15th. Let me know if you have any answers. Okay, Anirban. We will look into the right answer and see how our answer comes. Okay guys, so let us understand where the question is and where do you get a reference to this answer. So it says the author presents a possible economic solution to an existing issue facing Lozère that takes into account the divergent and competing interest of. Now if you were to go back to the passage, let's go back to the passage here. Okay. So let's read the first paragraph. It says residents of Lozère in southern France recite complaints familiar to many rural corners of Europe. Remote hamlets and villages with names such as Les Bacon and Les Bacon-Bourg mayors grumbled about lack of local schools, jobs and phone and internet connections. Then farmers of grazing animals add another concern, that return of wolves. So there is one more important concern here, which is the return of wolves. Eradicated from France last century, the predators are gradually creeping back to more forest and hillsides. The wolf must be taken in hand, said an aspiring parliamentarian, Francis Palombi, when pressed by voters in an election campaign early this summer. Tourists enjoy visiting a wolf park in Lozère, but farmers fret over their livestock and their livelihoods. So tourist is fine, and then just talked about the farmers. Let's go back further. Okay, now if you look at this part, it says, right, so yes, so it talks about active hunting and improved technology such as rifles in the 19th century, plus the use of poisons such as this later on caused the population collapse. But in the early 1990s, the animals reappeared. They crossed the Alps from the Italy, upsetting sheep farmers on the French side of the border. Okay, so you're talking about this here. Wolves have since spread to areas such as Lozère, delighting environmentalists. Okay, so you have a very important reference here. So wolves have since spread to areas such as Lozère, delighting environmentalists who see the predator's presence as a sign of wider ecological health. So it is the environmentalists which talk about the fact that it is an acceptance of wider ecological health here. So we are talking about farmers and environmentalists. Let's go back to the question now. Right, so it mentions tourist and environment. Tourist is not the answer, guys, because they have not been putting it their stakes here. It is not environmentalists and politicians. Politicians has not been mentioned. Politicians and farmers, even this is not the correct answer. You have farmers and environmentalists, which is option number D. So there is conflicting interest between the environmentalists and the people who are farmers. Right, let's go back to the last question for the day. Right, alright guys, let us discuss the last question and see to it how do we approach this question. So it says what? Which one of the following statements, if true, would weaken the author's claims? Okay, so we have to first identify what the author is saying. If you go back to the passage here, let's just go back. Okay, let's look at this last paragraph because it gives you a conclusion. It says, as the lupine population, so lupine refers to wolf. Now it says, as the lupine population of Europe spreads westwards with occasional reports of wolves seen closer to urban areas, expect to hear of more clashes between farmers and those who celebrate the predator's return. So there is a clash of interest between the farmers and people who are happy that the wolves are returning to the forest. Farmers' losses are real but are not the only economic story. Tourist avenues such as parks where wolves are kept and the animal spread is discussed also generate income and jobs in rural areas. If you go back further, right, so it has talked about various factors explain the changes of the past few decades. So it talks about rural depopulation, all right. It talks about as humans withdraw. Now it also talks about as more fields were given over to trees. It also talks about that more forests fall quiet. So you are talking about the reasons which is responsible for the return of these wolves to the place. If you go further, it says, if you look at this part here, it says here, tourists enjoy visiting a wolf park in Lozère, but farmers fret over the livestock and their livelihood. So there is a difference of opinion in terms of how tourists look into it and how it looks into the livelihoods of the farmers and so on. Let us look at the question now. Now, because we have to weaken the argument, let's look at the first option. It says wolf attacks on tourists in Lozère are on the rise. Now guys, if you have understood the main idea of the passage here, it was that the wolf population is returning and there is a sense of disagreement in terms of the environmentalists and the farmers. Now if you look at this option, it says wolf attack on tourists in Lozère are on the rise. So it is the okay, so look at this, wolf attacks on tourists in Lozère are on the rise. It means that it is the tourists who are enjoying in that particular area. But if you say that the wolf attack on tourists are have increased or they are on the rise, then it means that it weakens your main idea of the passage, that it is the wolf population which is going a step further. So if you look into those terms, this is A, which makes the correct choice. Yes, Anirban, your answer is correct, right? And if you look at the first option itself, it gives you a clear idea that this is how you negate the author's view and this becomes the main answer. Now let's look at B, C, D. It says having migrated out in the last century, wolves are now returning to Lozère. That is okay, but this point does not weaken the argument of the passage here. So that would be eliminated. C says the old mining sites of Lozère are now being used as a grazing pastures for sheep. It talks about mining sites and the pastures of sheep. Of course, that is not related because that does not actually weaken the main claim of the passage. So this will be cancelled out. Now, unemployment concern the residents of Lozère. Had unemployment be the concern of the residents, they would not have depopulated the area. So when you talk about depopulation of an area, even this particular option is eliminated. So the answer is A. Good, Anirban, that was the correct answer choice. Guys, this is how you are supposed to solve the RC. So we have solved a few questions of VA. We also solved an RC, and these questions are to be handled with an expertise that asks for a kind of practice from your side. Make sure that you are clear with the fundamentals of VA. You understand how a paragraph summary question is solved, how a sentence completion question is solved, and how do you manage the odd one out questions. RC requires a lot of practice. So you have to practice a lot of RCs and make sure that you understand the elimination process of how do you eliminate the choices. So the RC that we were solving, there were 4 questions and we eliminated the choices on the basis of what information was given to you in the passage. If you have got any more doubts, just let us know. If you want any more content, just let us know. We are running the series, so I will be back with more such content. By that time, just keep practicing, keep refining your concepts, work on your VA areas, work on your RC areas. And if you can just improve the practice arena there, it will help you to secure well. Okay, so that is all from my side, guys. We will continue with this series. So you have VARC section being covered, you have DILR section being covered, you have quant section being covered, and we are discussing the questions of all these 3 areas. So you have another session lined up. Just stay tuned for the notification and just carry on with it. Thank you so much. This was Sneha Batham dealing with the questions of VARC. See you next time. Thank you.